Brad's phone buzzed. His oldest son's name flashed on the screen. The kid needed to talk, something about trouble in paradise after just 3 years of marriage. Suspected infidelity. Brad's stomach clenched. He knew this dance all too well. "I can help," Brad told his son, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. Truth was, he'd buried those memories deep. Dredging them up would be like performing surgery on himself without anesthesia. But this was his flesh and blood asking for help. Brad and his ex-wife had weathered their own shitstorm back in the day. He owed it to the boy to share whatever wisdom he'd gleaned from the wreckage. Brad settled into his favorite armchair, notepad in hand. Might as well get comfortable. This trip down memory lane was gonna hurt like hell. But he'd be damned if he let his son navigate these treacherous waters alone. The memories came in flashes, vivid despite the years. High school, sophomore year. That's when Brad first laid eyes on Caroline, the undisputed queen bee of their class. Long blonde hair, curves in all the right places, eyes so blue you could drown in them. Every guy wanted her. Brad didn't stand a chance. He was a gangly mess back then, shy, awkward, about as cool as a dad at a middle school dance. But fate had other plans. Caroline's Sweet 16 bash. Brad wasn't even supposed to be there. He tagged along with a friend of a friend. But there she was, gliding through the crowd like some teenage goddess. Their eyes met across the room. She smiled, actually smiled at him, and made her way over. Without a word, she planted one on him. Just like that. Then she turned and sashayed back to her meathead boyfriend, Vernon something or other. The guy looked ready to commit murder. But Brad was flying too high to care. He was head over heels, hopelessly devoted to a girl who didn't know he existed. It was like something out of a corny teen movie. Caroline was the unattainable dream girl, Brad the lovesick nobody. But he was determined to make her his, no matter what it took. Slowly but surely, Brad clawed his way up the social ladder. By prom night, it was just the two of them. Caroline's parents had mercifully put the kibosh on Vernon. They sealed the deal that summer after graduation, drunk on young love and the promise of forever. Brad felt invincible. If only he'd known what was coming. Brad headed off to community college that fall, chasing his dream of becoming a math teacher. Caroline set her sights on nursing, moving into a dorm at one of the big hospitals downtown. 20 miles might as well have been 20,000. The next 4 years were a roller coaster. Between classes and work, Brad barely had time to breathe, let alone nurture a relationship. But life had other plans for testing his mettle. His old man collapsed at work one day, massive brain hemorrhage. The doctors had to crack his skull open, scoop out chunks of his brain. Left a dent you could see from space. The company tossed Dad a measly severance package and kicked him to the curb. Just like that, the family breadwinner was reduced to a shell of a man, parked in his armchair day after day. Mom had to pick up the slack, leaving Brad to wrangle his younger siblings. His brother Todd went off the rails, skipping school and tanking his grades. Brad lost count of how many times he had to bail the kid out of trouble. Then there was Susan, his baby sister. Too pretty for her own good, she attracted all the wrong kinds of attention. Brad spent half his time playing bodyguard, chasing off creeps twice her age. But the real gut punch came from his mom. With Dad essentially checked out, she started sneaking off to the local dive bar for some extracurricular activities. Brad wasn't an idiot. He knew what those late nights at work really meant. His father knew too. The proud man never said a word, but Brad could see the hurt in his eyes. It was like watching him die by inches. When Dad finally did kick the bucket, it broke something in Mom. She became a ghost, drifting through the house in a fog of grief and guilt. Meanwhile, Brad and Caroline's relationship hit some turbulence. They broke up a few times, always managing to patch things up. But looking back, Brad realized those breaks were probably Caroline test driving other options. He tried to ignore the nagging doubts, the suspicions that gnawed at him. But one day, paranoia got the better of him. He started calling Caroline's dorm obsessively, only to be cockblocked by her roommates at every turn. They fed him a line about Caroline being too upset to talk, crying her eyes out over what a jerk he was being. It was bullshit and Brad knew it. He'd never been anything but good to her. Desperation drove him to stake out her dorm, hoping to catch her in the act. But Caroline was too smart for that. All Brad accomplished was driving himself crazy. Eventually, he graduated and landed a gig teaching high school math. Caroline scored a sweet job at a pediatric clinic near their hometown. They tied the knot, had a picture-perfect wedding, and rode off into the sunset. A few months later, Caroline dropped the pregnancy bomb. Their first, a boy they named after Brad. A couple years after that came little Bridget, named for Caroline's mom. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. They bought a starter home in a quiet neighborhood. Caroline climbed the ladder at work while Brad racked up promotions, eventually landing the principal gig at a new middle school. But something was off. Brad couldn't put his finger on it at first. They still talked about the day-to-day stuff, kids, bills, household crap. But the long-term plans? Those conversations had dried up. Caroline used to get so excited talking about their dream vacation, a cross-country road trip hitting all the big landmarks. Now, when Brad brought it up, she'd deflect or change the subject. It was the little things that set off Brad's spidey senses. The way Caroline avoided his eyes when he talked about the future. The subtle shift in her body language. Brad tried to shake it off, tell himself he was being paranoid. But deep down, he knew. Something was rotten in the state of Denmark. The tech revolution was still in its infancy, no smartphones, GPS, or ubiquitous laptops. Brad couldn't track Caroline's movements electronically, and hiring a PI felt wrong, not to mention unaffordable given Caroline's control of their finances. Their shared credit card was used sparingly by Brad, while Caroline managed all other expenses in cash. Her assurances that they were fine financially began to ring hollow. Brad's job as principal kept him busy with after-school events year-round. He started questioning Caroline's whereabouts during his absences, suspecting their teenage neighbor Jenny was babysitting more often than he knew. He realized how easy it would be for Caroline to have an affair, given their separate work commitments. Brad explained to his son that affairs could range from quick trysts to elaborate out-of-town encounters. The real issue was the power imbalance. Brad was just a teacher, while Caroline worked with doctors, veritable demigods in their blue-collar upbringing. How could he compete with lifesavers like the pediatric oncologist? Brad met Dr. Maynard Gilmore at a work event, thinking nothing of the divorced doctor. He trusted Caroline implicitly, blind to the warning signs. In the end, Caroline's own carelessness during basketball season brought everything crashing down. Caroline started slipping up, getting sloppy with her schedule. She used to stick to Fridays, but now she was stepping out other nights too. Brad found himself home more often when she rolled in from her girls' nights out. It was like watching a student try to cheat on a test. At first, they're careful, sticking to a pattern. But then they get cocky, start taking risks. That's when they get caught. Brad couldn't ignore the signs anymore. It wasn't just the alcohol on her breath or the way she'd breeze past him and the kids. It was her whole vibe. Caroline had always been a fashionista, obsessed with the latest trends. Her hair and makeup were always on point. So why was she coming home looking like she'd been dragged through a hedge backward? The first couple times, Brad played dumb. But soon, he couldn't pretend anymore. One night, he finally called her out. "Caroline, what's the deal with these late nights?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She blinked at him, clearly 3 sheets to the wind. "What do you mean?" "Look at yourself," Brad said, gesturing to her disheveled appearance. "Where have you been? You look like you've been mud wrestling." "Just out with friends," she slurred. Brad's patience was wearing thin. "Really? With who?" Caroline rattled off a list of names, including a couple of doctors. One stood out, Maynard Gilmore. "Caroline, you don't look well," Brad pressed. "What's going on?" Maybe it was the booze loosening her tongue, but Caroline's filter was gone. "For Christ's sake, Brad, you know." "I know you know." Brad's heart dropped to his stomach. "No, Caroline, I don't know." And then she dropped the bomb. "Me and Dr. Gilmore, you know?" the world tilted on its axis. Brad felt like he was going to be sick. "No, Caroline. What do you mean, you and Dr. Gilmore?" Caroline's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, Brad." Brad's first thought was denial. This couldn't be happening. But deep down, he knew it was true. Caroline kept talking, the words tumbling out between sobs. "Dr. Gilmore and me, Brad, I'm so sorry. We love each other." In that moment, Brad's world imploded. Everything he thought he knew came crashing down around him. His mind raced, grasping for something to say, something to do. But all he could manage was, "You're leaving me." It wasn't a question. He knew it was over. No warning, no preparation. One minute he had a wife, a family, a home. The next? Nothing but a gaping void. Caroline sat there, a mess of smeared makeup and rumpled clothes, reeking of booze. "Yes, Brad, I guess I am." She tried to put on a sympathetic face, but Brad saw right through it. He'd seen that same act from countless students over the years. "Brad, I love you," Caroline said, her voice wavering. "I've always loved you. I'm just not in love with you anymore." The cliché hit Brad like a sucker punch. His marriage had become a bad rom-com plot twist. In an instant, shock gave way to rage. Blind, all-consuming fury. Brad's eyes landed on Caroline's prized curio cabinet. Before he knew what he was doing, he was across the room, yanking the door off its hinges. His hands found fragile heirlooms, Waterford crystal, Swarovski figurines, priceless family trinkets. He hurled them across the room, shattering them against the walls. Caroline screamed, begging him to stop. But Brad was just getting started. He moved on to the TV, the stereo, the framed paintings. Anything in reach became a target for his wrath. The dining room was next. Fine china, wedding gifts, crystal stemware, all reduced to glittering shards on the floor. Brad's eyes fell on their wedding photo. Grinning bride and groom, frozen in time. He ripped it from the frame, tearing it to confetti. "Hooray, it's over!" he shouted, tossing the pieces in the air like some twisted celebration. The kitchen was his final battleground. Chairs became battering rams, everyday dishes became projectiles. He even wrenched off the fancy faucet Caroline had insisted on. She followed him, crying and pleading. But Brad was beyond reason. Every dish, every glass, were they even his anymore? He flung open the fridge, emptying its contents onto the floor. Milk pooled with iced tea, leftover chicken splattered across the linoleum. And then, as quickly as it started, it was over. Brad found his terrified children in the doorway, causing him to break down. Caroline's demeanor shifted as she coldly told him to leave. Numb, Brad packed and left, finding temporary lodging before settling near their house. 20 years later, Brad reflected on that night while considering how to tell his son. Caroline had quickly secured a restraining order and lawyer. During negotiations, Brad sought answers, but Caroline's cruel response devastated him. She revealed her true feelings, admitting to never truly loving him and detailing her infidelities. Though crushed, Brad sensed something off about Caroline's tirade. It seemed rehearsed, with hints of guilt beneath the cruelty. He realized Caroline had been grappling with her own issues, having used him as a placeholder all along. By the end of her vicious confession, Brad's hatred had transformed into emptiness. Caroline was now dead to him, a realization she clearly saw in his eyes. The divorce settlement left Brad reeling. Caroline got the house and half their savings, while Brad settled for reasonable child support and limited visitation. He swallowed his pride to avoid workplace drama, letting Caroline keep her job and new relationship. Brad's heartfelt goodbye to Caroline fell flat, and things worsened as she poisoned the kids against him. But small mercies emerged. Brad's family helped him secure a decent condo, and Caroline's hasty remarriage and pregnancy inadvertently pushed the kids back to Brad. Work became a minefield of rumors and lost respect. Brad's self-esteem plummeted, leading to a 6-month bender of meaningless hookups and self-destructive behavior. He tried to even the score, revamping his image and flaunting his newfound freedom, but it only made him more miserable. Just when things seemed bleakest, salvation appeared in the form of Miss Winters, a pint-sized redhead who caught Brad's eye. This sassy, beloved teacher breezed by his office, setting the stage for a potential turning point in Brad's tumultuous post-divorce life. Something made her pause. She backtracked, slipped into his office, and shut the door behind her. Brad's world was about to flip upside down again. Miss Winters plopped herself down in the chair across from him. "Brad," she said, foregoing formalities, "I can see you're hurting. Let me help." Brad bristled at her use of his first name. "Miss Winters," he replied, emphasizing her title, "I'm perfectly fine. Is there something I can do for you?" She flashed him a smile that could melt glaciers. Then she launched into a monologue that left Brad's head spinning. "Mr. Whitmore, Brad," she began, "I'm pushing 32. I'm no supermodel. I've got a 5-year-old and a deadbeat ex. But I know I can help you." Brad tried to cut her off, but she was on a roll. "I see it, Brad. You're stuck in a hole, and you don't know how to climb out. Trust me, I've been there." He stood up, ready to show her the door. "Look here, Miss Winters." But she wasn't having it. "Mr. Whitmore, everyone knows what went down. They're all walking on eggshells, but not me. I've decided you need my help. I've seen your kids, they're sweethearts, and..." Jesus, she was freaking him out. Brad took a step back, trying to regain control of the situation. Before he could get a word in edgewise, she pressed on. "Yes, I know. This is wildly inappropriate. Family drama is off limits. But hear me out." Brad's brain was short-circuiting. He tried to focus on anything but her eyes, which seemed to see right through him. "Tomorrow," she said abruptly, turning on her heel and marching out of his office. Brad stood there, gobsmacked. What the hell had just happened? After a few seconds, he collected himself. This had to be one of three things: a genuine offer of friendship, a response to some twisted teacher's bet, or a straight-up booty call. Brad's first instinct was to get her transferred out of his school ASAP. He reached for the phone, ready to call his supervisor, Dr. Deshields. But then he paused. Transferring her might backfire. He could end up with some incompetent loser in her place. And sending Miss Winters to a rougher school? The wolves there would eat her alive. Brad hung up the phone, sighing. He'd have to handle this mess on his own. The next day, Miss Winters strutted in looking like she'd raided the sexy librarian section of a Halloween store. Gone was her usual frumpy tweed. In its place, a silky green blouse that matched her eyes and a skirt that left little to the imagination. Every head in the school turned as she passed. Yeah, Brad thought, she's definitely gunning for me. She seemed to materialize near the main office every time Brad turned around. It was getting ridiculous. At the end of the day, as Brad headed for his car, she ambushed him. "Help me carry these boxes?" she asked, all innocence. When they finished loading her car, she stood on tiptoe and pecked his cheek. "I hope to see you Friday after school," she murmured. "I'll be waiting outside Denny's." Brad tried to shut her down. "This is a bad idea. I could lose my job." She just smiled. "Only if I complained. And that's never gonna happen." With a wink, she added, "You need someone. I think I can help." Brad told her she was nuts. She just grinned wider. That was Wednesday. Brad spent Thursday and Friday dodging her, but he couldn't help sneaking glances when she wasn't looking. He had to admit, as tiny as she was easy on the eyes. Nothing like his ex. Friday rolled around, cold and frosty. Brad was sure Miss Winters wouldn't be dumb enough to wait in a freezing parking lot on the off chance he'd show. But curiosity got the better of him. He drove by Denny's just to check. There she was, shivering in the cold. Damn it. Brad pulled in, planning to give her a stern lecture while he walked her to her car. But as he approached, she beamed and started leading him toward the restaurant entrance. "I'm thinking you look like a Grand Slam kinda guy," she laughed. Brad grumbled, "I can't stay long. Maybe just coffee." She squeezed his arm. "We'll see about that." As they settled into a booth, Brad's mind raced. Teacher-student affairs were as old as schools themselves, but they usually involved at least a pretense of discretion. He'd caught a few over the years, like the time he walked in on a young teacher entertaining the English department head in the book room. They'd scattered like roaches in the light, and nothing more was said. Is that what Miss Winters wanted? Some tawdry secret fling? Brad couldn't imagine anything else. This is a one-time thing, he warned her. I only stopped because I couldn't let you freeze out there. Her eyes twinkled. No, you stopped because you're a gentleman. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You know, I've been crushing on you since you came to Oakcrest. My ex walked out on me and our daughter just weeks before you arrived. He crushed me in the divorce, not the money, but the things he said. Miss Winters's eyes misted over. I saw you with your kids. You were so beautiful together. So happy. I'm sorry, but ever since your wife left. I don't know the details, but I know what happened. She reached across the table, grasping Brad's hand. Please, let me help. Brad had to give it to her. Miss Winters wasn't beating around the bush. She laid her cards on the table, no holds barred. Still, Brad felt he needed to set her straight. Miss Winters, I appreciate your concern, your sympathy. But I need to warn you, I don't see you as a potential romantic partner. She threw her head back, laughing. Good Lord, I hope not. No one ever has and no one ever will. I just want us to be friends. We're kindred spirits, Brad. I've been through this mess. We can swap war stories. I know I can help. Brad was floored. First, he realized his comment about her unattractiveness had stung, and it wasn't even true. Half the men and most of the boys at school were gaga over her. Second, he was pretty sure she was lying about not wanting romance. And third, maybe he did need her help. He backpedaled. I didn't mean you're not beautiful. You are, very much so. In any other circumstance, I'd definitely be interested. But we're colleagues. I've got a school to run. Yes, we can be friends. But let's keep it professional too. She nodded, a smile playing at her lips. Let's have a play date. I'll bring my little girl, you bring your kids. We can talk. Brad found himself noticing little details about her, the length of her eyelashes, the emerald studs in her ears, the way a strand of auburn hair fell across her left eye. He had to resist the urge to brush it back. Okay, he said. Pick a day and time. Miss Winters glanced up, then back at Brad. Not this weekend. How about next Saturday? You decide what and where. No, Brad countered. You decide. She grinned. No, you're the man. You decide. Brad hadn't heard that kind of talk in years. He tried not to puff up his chest. All right, next Saturday. I'll let you know the plan next week. They stood, shaking hands. Brad walked her to her car, a beat-up Volkswagen, a far cry from Caroline's taste in vehicles. At her car, they shook hands again. Brad helped her in, watching as she drove away. As soon as she was out of sight, doubt crept in. Brad checked his watch, realizing he needed to hurry home before the kids arrived. That night, after tucking the kids in, Brad made the mistake of digging out old photos of him and Caroline. When she left, she'd only taken pics of the kids, leaving their wedding album behind. Brad flipped through the memories, a lump forming in his throat. Before he knew it, he was crying. He knew he had to end things with Miss Winters before they even began. Monday morning found Brad on hallway duty when Miss Winters came in to grab her mail. His face must have given him away. She went pale when she saw him. Brad chickened out. Plastering on a smile, he strode over to her. Morning, he said loudly, not caring who heard. There's a skating rink near my place. We could take the kids skating, then have lunch at my house. Teachers and students bustled by, pretending not to eavesdrop. By day's end, the whole school would know Mr. Whitmore and Miss Winters were an item. Miss Winters looked uncertain. Brad's initial expression must have spooked her. I never learned to skate, she hedged. And my daughter. Brad gently touched her hand. Perfect. I'll teach you. She finally relaxed, a genuine smile spreading across her face. Okay, let's do it. The next day was the monthly faculty meeting. As Miss Winters entered the cafeteria, Brad subtly nodded to the table nearest him. She took the hint, sitting up front. Brad was done hiding. People would gossip anyway. He wanted everyone to know this was about friendship, not some sordid affair. The meeting dragged on as usual. Department heads droned, the athletic director pontificated. When Brad opened the floor for questions, the usual complaints poured in. Why aren't we enforcing the dress code? Can't we make the kids clean up their own cafeteria messes? I refuse to attend meetings that open with prayer. Brad listened patiently, reminding everyone to check for school closings on the local radio station. He wrapped up by reiterating that they were all there to teach. As he looked out at his staff, Brad's thoughts wandered. He pondered the prayer in schools debate, the few teachers he couldn't stand, and the small group he privately dubbed the headhunters, those who seemed to live for catching kids breaking rules. One particularly nasty old bat came to mind. She couldn't teach her way out of a paper bag, but boy, did she know the rule book inside and out. Brad remembered the time she dragged a little girl to him, triumphantly pointing out her leather coat, a clear violation of district policy. The poor kid was on the verge of tears. "Mr. Whitmore, it's suede, not leather," she'd whimpered. Brad had smiled at the girl, taking the coat. "It's okay, sweetie." Then, fixing the old battle axe with a steely glare, he'd growled, "You heard her. Suede coat." The teacher had stomped off in a huff, much to the amusement of the other kids in the hall. Later that day, a printout had appeared on Brad's desk, the dictionary definition of suede, highlighted in neon yellow. Real mature. Then there were the prayer nuts, a gaggle of elderly ladies who insisted every assembly start with a good ol' "Dear Lord." Brad didn't mind, but it ruffled some feathers. A couple of younger teachers had threatened to boycott assembly duty if the prayers continued. Brad had calmly agreed, then reassigned them to cafeteria duty, the ninth circle of school hell. He chuckled, imagining them dodging flying tater tots and mystery meat for 25 minutes a day. Why was he dwelling on these petty tyrants? Because most of them had a special hatred for Miss Winters. Poor Sheena was constantly being hauled before one assistant principal or another for her unorthodox teaching methods. She dared to hold mock trials in her classroom. She took kids on field trips. She even, gasp, let them use the bathroom during class. In other words, Sheena Winters was everything the "that's not my job" crowd despised: creative, innovative, and actually giving a damn about the kids. Okay, so maybe Brad had a soft spot for Miss Winters. If he played it cool, kept things on the down low, no one could complain. He could have a friend, right? Wrong. It all went downhill from there. The ice skating date was a comedy of errors. Brad hadn't been on skates since the divorce. Bridget had never learned. Brad Jr. was the only one who didn't spend more time on his butt than his blades. Sheena and her daughter Laura were like newborn foals on the ice. Even Brad took a few spills. But damn if it wasn't the most fun he'd had in years. After the rink, they headed back to Brad's place for homemade pizza and a Disney movie marathon. Even too cool for school, Brad Jr. got into it. Before Brad knew it, he and Sheena were dating for real. But she insisted that all their outings include the kids. This woman was the real deal. Sheena laid it all out for Brad's children. She wasn't trying to replace their mom. She just wanted to be Brad's friend and help where she could. Brad kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong. But nothing did. His life just kept getting better. As he jotted down notes for his son, Brad realized there was more to Sheena's story that needed telling. Who was she, really? What had she been through? How had she become such an integral part of their lives? Brad Jr. knew some of it, but there were gaps to fill. Brad remembered the aftermath of his divorce, the loneliness, the bitterness, the despair, the gnawing sense of inadequacy. It was the kind of pain that could hollow a person out from the inside. He'd constantly questioned where he'd fallen short. As a provider? A father? A lover? Caroline had never given him a straight answer. Brad had been desperate for closure, for some kind of explanation. But it never came. Somehow, Sheena had sensed all of this. She seemed to understand on a level Brad couldn't fathom. Opening up to her hadn't been easy. Brad's trust in women had been shattered. He'd even gone so far as to run a background check on Sheena after their first real date. Her college records were unremarkable, just a standard state school degree, like his own. She was a bit younger, with a young daughter. No mention of a husband, which made Brad wonder if her bad divorce story was just that, a story. Paranoia had driven Brad to stake out Sheena's apartment complex, watching for any sign that she was seeing other men or hitting the bars after work. It had been agonizing to let his guard down, to risk trusting another person. But Sheena had been patient. Their first dates were low-key affairs, Denny's, maybe a movie. Was Brad being cheap? Hell yes. But he needed to suss out this woman before investing too much. What he learned blew his mind. It was like reading a familiar book, but from a whole new perspective. Sheena's story unfolded one night after the kids were asleep. They just spent another blissful, exhausting evening tangled in Brad's sheets. Like Brad, Sheena had fallen for her high school sweetheart. Unlike Brad, they'd thrown caution to the wind when it came to protection. Sheena found herself knocked up in junior high. Her boyfriend wanted her to take care of it, but Sheena couldn't bring herself to do it. They tied the knot, juggling work and school while finishing college. Sheena's uncle, a judge, pulled some strings to land her the Oakcrest gig. Her ex became a car salesman, hawking overpriced Swedish rides to midlife crisis victims. Brad had heard rumors about the type of jerks who bought those cars, but he stuck to his trusty American-made wheels. According to Sheena, her ex was a decent salesman but a lousy husband and even worse in the sack. She'd never fully grasped the meaning of wham, bam, thank you ma'am, until she got hitched. He never laid a hand on her, but affection was in short supply. When Sheena finally packed her bags and went home to her parents, her ex tried to snatch their daughter. Sheena's dad swooped in with a restraining order, and her uncle hooked her up with a shark of a lawyer. The ex finally backed off. The divorce went through, leaving Sheena practically solo with baby Laura. But her folks weren't about to let her sink. Laura was still in diapers, and Sheena's mom became her lifeline. As Sheena spilled her guts, Brad realized that as nasty as his split from Caroline had been, Sheena's divorce made his look like a walk in the park. Caroline and her Dr. Boy toy had never threatened Brad or made him fear for his safety. Nobody had tried to strong-arm him or mess with his kids. It hit Brad like a ton of bricks. He'd fallen hard for Sheena. And it scared the living daylights out of him. He was terrified of putting his heart on the line again. But Sheena saw right through his defenses. She told Brad about her ex's Jekyll and Hyde routine. One minute he'd be raging, telling her he'd found someone hotter, richer, better in bed. The next, he'd be a blubbering mess, saying Sheena was too good for him, that he needed someone who wasn't afraid to get down and dirty. When the dust settled, Sheena's ex came clean about all his affairs. He'd cheated because it was a thrill, an adventure. He knew he could get away with it. He told Sheena she was boring, that he couldn't stomach the thought of being stuck with her forever. As Brad listened, he realized Sheena's ex was spouting the same crap Caroline had thrown at him. It was like there was a cheater's handbook of excuses they all pulled from. But Sheena's ex and Caroline had been right about one thing: neither of them deserved the person they'd betrayed. Hearing Sheena's story, Brad finally understood why Caroline had bailed. It wasn't about careers or money or status. It was because deep down, Caroline knew Brad was the better person. She was the one who'd fallen short, not him. Brad convinced Sheena to ditch her apartment and move in with him and Laura. A few weeks later, they sat the kids down for the talk. The Rugrats took it better than they'd hoped. Before long, Brad and Sheena were tying the knot themselves. It was a small affair, just their parents, Brad's siblings and their kids, and a handful of teacher friends. But it was perfect. Brad loved Sheena with every fiber of his being. He'd found happiness again, found his other half. And he was pretty sure Sheena felt the same way. His feelings toward Caroline had shifted. The hatred was gone, replaced by pity. While Brad's life was on the upswing, Caroline seemed to be circling the drain. She'd already popped out one kid with Dr. Gilmore, but apparently, he wasn't all she dreamed of either. Word on the street was that Caroline had traded up again, this time for a hotshot heart surgeon. Brad didn't know what to make of it all. He and Caroline had dated for nearly 6 years and been hitched for a dozen before she pulled the plug. She'd barely made it 3 years with Gilmore. Brad was sure there was more to the story, but one thing was crystal clear: Caroline was damaged goods. Caroline divorced again? Shacked up with a heart surgeon? Yep, and rumor had it she was blissfully happy this time around. But with Caroline, who knew how long that would last? Brad had learned his lesson the hard way. He'd thought he had it all once before, only to watch it crumble to dust. This time, he knew he'd been given a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. As Brad wrapped up his notes for his son, he realized there were still loose ends to tie up. Who was Sheena, really? What demons had she faced? How had she become such an integral part of their family? Some of it, Brad Jr. already knew. But there were gaps to fill, things his son needed to hear. Brad remembered the crushing loneliness after the divorce, the bitterness that threatened to consume him. He'd felt inadequate, less than. It was the kind of pain that could eat a person alive from the inside out. He'd spent countless nights wondering where he'd fallen short. As a provider? A father? A lover? Caroline had never given him a straight answer. Brad had been desperate for closure, for some kind of explanation. But it never came. Somehow, Sheena had sensed all of this. She seemed to understand on a level Brad couldn't fathom. Opening up to Sheena hadn't been a walk in the park. Brad's trust in women had been shattered into a million pieces. He'd even stooped so low as to run a background check on her after their first real date. Sheena's college records were about as exciting as watching paint dry, just your average state school diploma, like his own. She was a few years his junior, with a little girl in tow. No husband mentioned, which made Brad wonder if her bad divorce story was just smoke and mirrors. Paranoia had Brad playing amateur detective, staking out Sheena's apartment complex like some low-budget noir film. He was on high alert for any sign that she was sneaking around with other guys or hitting the bars after work. It had been like pulling teeth to let his guard down, to even consider trusting another human being. But Sheena had the patience of a saint. Their first dates were as no frills as it gets, greasy spoon diners, maybe a movie if Brad was feeling fancy. Was he being a cheapskate? You bet your ass he was. But he needed to figure this woman out before he invested too much of himself. What he discovered blew his mind. It was like reading a familiar book, but suddenly understanding all the subtext you'd missed before. Sheena's story unfolded one night after the kids were out cold. They'd just spent another evening tangled in Brad's sheets, blissfully exhausted. Like Brad, Sheena had fallen hard for her high school sweetheart. Unlike Brad, they'd played fast and loose with birth control. Sheena found herself in the family way while still rocking braces and worrying about pre-algebra. Her boyfriend wanted to take care of it, but Sheena couldn't bring herself to go through with it. They got hitched, burning the candle at both ends to finish school while working and raising a kid. Sheena's uncle, a big-shot judge, pulled some strings to land her the Oakcrest gig. Her ex ended up slinging overpriced Swedish cars to middle-aged guys trying to recapture their youth. Brad had heard rumors about the type of jerks who bought those rides, but he stuck to his trusty American-made wheels. According to Sheena, her ex could sell ice to Eskimos, but he was a dud of a husband and even worse between the sheets. She'd never fully grasped the concept of wham, bam, thank you ma'am, until she got hitched. He never raised a hand to her, but affection was about as common as a unicorn sighting. When Sheena finally grew a spine and bailed to her parents' place, her ex tried to snatch their daughter. Sheena's dad swooped in like a caped crusader with a restraining order, and her uncle hooked her up with a lawyer who made pit bulls look cuddly. The ex finally got the message and backed off. The divorce went through, leaving Sheena flying solo with a baby on her hip. But her folks weren't about to let her crash and burn. Laura was still in diapers, and Sheena's mom became her lifeline. As Sheena spilled her guts, Brad realized that as nasty as his split from Caroline had been, Sheena's divorce made his look like a lover's spat. Caroline and her Dr. Boy toy had never made Brad fear for his safety or his kids. Nobody had tried to strong-arm him or play dirty. It hit Brad like a sledgehammer. He'd fallen head over heels for Sheena. And it scared him shitless. He was terrified of putting his heart on the chopping block again. But Sheena saw right through his tough guy act. She told Brad about her ex's Jekyll and Hyde routine. One minute he'd be on a rampage, bragging about his new squeeze who was hotter, richer, and a freak in the sheets. The next, he'd be a blubbering mess, saying Sheena was too good for him, that he needed someone who wasn't afraid to get down and dirty. When the dust settled, Sheena's ex came clean about all his extracurricular activities. He'd cheated because it gave him a rush, made him feel alive. He knew he could get away with it. He told Sheena she was as exciting as watching grass grow, that he couldn't stomach the thought of being shackled to her for life. As Brad listened, he realized Sheena's ex was reading from the same playbook as Caroline. It was like there was a cheater's Bible they all pulled their lines from. But Sheena's ex and Caroline had been right about one thing: neither of them deserved the person they'd screwed over. Hearing Sheena's story, Brad finally got why Caroline had hit the eject button. It wasn't about careers or money or status. It was because deep down, Caroline knew Brad was the better half. She was the one who dropped the ball, not him. Brad convinced Sheena to ditch her shoebox apartment and move in with him and Laura. A few weeks later, they gathered the kids for the talk. The Rugrats took it better than they dared hope. Before long, Brad and Sheena were saying, "I do." It was a no-frills affair, just their folks, Brad's siblings and their broods, and a handful of teacher pals. But it was perfect. Brad loved Sheena with every cell in his body. He'd struck gold twice, found his missing puzzle piece. And he was pretty sure Sheena